Let me make sure that this isn't. 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and mute that just in case. What's that? My channel. Alright, we are live. Alright. So, and while it's not as extreme as my European history class, where like the first chapter is like 5 or 6 different places, oftentimes the first test is going to be the hardest in terms of material, because that first chapter we have to pull so much stuff together before we can even begin. Because you've got the natives all over North America, and then the various European powers coming over and doing their thing. For test 2, it's going to be mostly just the English colonies doing their thing. We're not going to be talking that much about France and Spain. They're really just there kind of as adversaries now at this point. And then chapter 6 is actually the American Revolution. And then once we're past that, it's just going to be, you know, the beginnings of America. So thematically, it won't be as scattered. I often find that, at least in terms of how I keep things together in my head, the later tests are actually easier because they're less scattered. Okay, so on to chapter 5. So chapter 5 is, sorry, not chapter 5, chapter 4, my mistake. Religious strife and social upheavals. 1680 to 1750. Again, we're going to be going like up to 1750 until the next couple of chapters, because then we're going to get right up to the years that things go down. But this is, again, kind of a retread of the last chapter in terms of chronology, but obviously we're going to have very specific topics here. So, we're going to talk about the Puritans again, because of course we are. The Puritans in New England were often unhappy with everything that was going on, despite the fact that they came to the New World to, you know, escape the wickedness of England. But now they're in New England, like, oh, it's bad here too. So it's the world, guys. Get used to it. Let's see. Citing examples of the depravity in his diary, including drunkenness and cursing, he claimed that such high-handed wickedness had hardly been heard of before. It's like, my dude, you know nothing about history. So Samuel Sewall, he was the guy who actually talked about the high-handed wickedness. He had a lot to complain about, in particular the mercantile elite. He said, let's see, Sewall was outraged as well by popular practices such as donning powdered wigs in place of God-given hair, wearing scarlet and gold jackets rather than simple black cloth, and offering toasts rather than prayers. Yeah, he didn't like the merchants doing what merchants do. Some weren't quite as extreme. We have Cotton Mather, the son of Increase Mather. Told you guys we were getting there. While he was also a minister and did his best to maintain this Puritan ideal, he also understood that you lived in the world and you sort of had to be a part of that. He did complain about colonists participating in less feast days, which were, you know, basically the big religious holidays. But also he wanted his son to, quote, become a more refined gentleman. So he wasn't insisting that his son wear sackcloth and, you know, be a minister necessarily. Mather even supported scientific advancements like the smallpox inoculation, which back when I wrote this originally was not that big a deal, but after the last few years, the fact that you have like a Puritan minister saying that inoculations are a good thing and that you should probably listen to what science is of the day, yeah, that's suddenly really a big deal because some people are really dumb. We had the Glorious Revolution over in England, as we mentioned, which, while it wasn't as good for Puritans as, say, Cromwell being in charge, England had given a bit more authority to other religions. It wasn't as heavy-handed Anglican anymore. The Glorious Revolution made things settle down a lot. However, we're still in North America, and, the English are still pissing off the natives. So we had King William's War, this anxiety of native attacks, and this belief that Satan was at work in the region. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Because, the signs of nature are signs of God, but also the devil? Question mark. Anyway, here's Sewell, kind of a gouty-looking fellow. And I always forget just quite how comical Cotton Mather looked. So, when it comes to concerns about Satan, you could only really point the finger to so many places. Because, oh, no, bad things happen, it's probably Satan. Well, you need a person to blame. And that's where we get witchcraft. This is certainly not new. This is not something that they came up with in New England. It had been widespread across Europe. And it was a scapegoat for any time something bad happened. Unexpected storms, fires, sudden death of livestock, that sort of thing. Because it's like, hey, this was definitely the devil, but also the devil's agents in the world are witches, and therefore anybody we don't like is probably a witch. Therefore, let's throw them in a bonfire. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Puritans believed that God worked through nature, but also so did Satan. And again, it's like, where do you draw the line? Because remember, the Puritans were like, hey, God came in and murdered a bunch of natives with smallpox. That's a great thing. But if the Europeans get sick, suddenly it's Satan. So we had, deformed children, astrological signs, eclipses, that sort of thing. Which again, depending on what the context was, it could be either God or Satan. So, when things were going poorly, it was easy to point the finger at those that were outside what was considered, societally acceptable. In particular, women, because again, as we've seen, women had basically no power. Or actually, no, we're going to be seeing a little bit later this chapter because we're going to get into all of that. They were quarrelsome, eccentric, or poor. So, weird old lady living out in the woods, definitely a witch. Also because she's got nobody to back her up, therefore she's got no kind of legal recourse. So you can just do whatever. So whenever there were times of change, these beliefs in witches tended to explode because, oh no, things are changing and we're scared, therefore the devil. 17th century was full of changes. The colonists pushing west, which of course pissed off the natives. And also, as they get further away from the coast, they are getting to more harsh environments. They're getting towards the mountains, rivers that are larger and more dangerous. So again, though, oh no, big storm, definitely the devil. So between 1647 and 1692, 160 individuals were accused of being witches. About 15 of them were put to death. So this was about the normal percentage when you go to, say, Europe and look at witchcraft trials. They accuse a bunch of people, and about 10% of them actually end up being murdered for it. So over here in North America, it was oftentimes, crops going bad, livestock dying, etc. So while we mentioned that a lot of them were poor, childless, and disgruntled women, some actually were women who had some level of means. Again, as we're going to see a little bit later this chapter, a lot of young women managed to inherit property because, well, men tend to die sooner than women, and also back then, as again we're going to see in a little bit, a lot of younger women would marry older men, and then the men would die, and it's like, well, they get their stuff. But there was this patriarchal order of the time where, like, a male relative would try to come and take her property, or even neighbors who claimed they had more right over the property than a woman did, and if she tried to defend herself, definitely a witch. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't, really. And I found some weird images. So here's one. I don't know, Satan looks pretty chill in this one. Hanging out with some folks, passing out. I'm guessing these are like, what's the word? A voodoo doll is right, but I'm trying to find a different word for it. Like effigies. Yeah, which essentially is a voodoo doll. But yeah, where you use these things and curse them, and it would curse the person that they represent. I don't know why everybody here has, like, crimson chins going on, or what the hell is happening up here, but I don't know, I like this image. It's amusing. What's up?
Why did they never, say a man could be a witch?
There was some of that. There was some, like, male practitioners of witchcraft, but they were accused less often because men actually could defend themselves in court. That's a big reason why. But there was, we're going to, obviously the next step is the Salem witch trials. And there were a few men who were accused. But for the most part, it was women because they couldn't defend themselves. They didn't have any, like, legal standing. What's up?
Didn't they throw them into a river, and if they sank, they weren't a witch, but if they floated, they were a witch?
Yes. So if you drown, you're innocent. If you manage to swim, they'll pull you back out and, like, find some other way to kill you. Yeah. Interestingly enough, actually, I was my other class is like early Western civilization. So we start with, like, Mesopotamia, and they had a similar trial by ordeal. But if they threw you in a river and you didn't drown, you were considered innocent. So I feel like that was, like, better than what we have here. Still not great, but it's like, oh no, the gods are sparing you, as opposed to the river accepts you. It's like, yeah, accept all that river water in your lungs.
So do they have, actual trials, or is it just,
Yes, sometimes.
you're a witch?
It depended on where they were and, like, how isolated the village was. A lot of times there will be some level of a trial, which we'll get into here in just a minute with Salem. But it was mostly like, we think you're witches, and there's more of us than there are of you, therefore, into the fire. I also found this image. I don't know entirely what's happening. This cat is not happy with what's going on. These people are, like, freaking out. I don't know what this little goblin child is doing over here. I mean, the window might have just blown open and now everybody's like losing their shit. So who knows? I've got another really good one. Oh, I knew there was a dog in here. He's over here. He's kind of blending in with this guy. He's just hanging out. Oh, and this one too. So one of the less extreme things, you put people in the stockades for a couple of days, you know, public humiliation. And, you know, it was a spectacle. Everybody was having a great time. I mean, you got a kid here hanging out the window, like wanting to see what's going on. She looks like she's been here before. She's fine. This is very much the first time meme. She's just like, oh, this is your first time at the stockades. What are you whining about? This dude's not having a good day. But like everybody else is having a grand time. Everybody's smiling. I mean, because it was a public event. It was the most exciting thing you're going to do in your town for probably your entire life, is see people persecuted for reasons.
So did the husbands like not even try to defend their wives? Because they don't.
Well, if the women were married, they typically weren't accused, because then they would have some legal recourse because their husband could defend them. But if they were, you know, a widow or a single lady like living outside the town who doesn't really interact with the community, they're definitely suspicious. Right. Yes. So a lot of times married women weren't accused because they would have that that defense. But again, as we're about to see in Salem, it broke a lot of those norms. Salem was kind of crazy. So, on to Salem. Obviously, the most infamous of the American witch hunts was Salem in the 1690s. There was a lot going on in Salem prior to suddenly witches. Obviously, they're in the northeast. They're right there near where all the native attacks are happening. You've got the Glorious Revolution in England, which has been changing the political landscape. Also, and this is something that isn't talked about much, you had newer families moving in, and that pissed off the older families that were already there. So, you know, you've got, oh, new people are moving in, they're ruining the neighborhood or whatever. But also, and this may have been like the biggest part, was this new minister that came in. Because in Puritan towns, a minister was basically like a government authority. Like every town had a minister. It wasn't, oh yeah, each church has a minister. Each town had a minister that like would help run the town. Well, Salem had been without a minister for, I want to say, a couple of years. And so they get this new minister in, Samuel Parris, and he's from, I don't remember exactly where he was from, but he wasn't from the area. So they treated him like an outsider, and he treated them like, you know, backwoods rednecks, which Salem was one of the bigger cities in Boston and Massachusetts at the time, but whatever. He treated them less than good. So when things finally did happen, everybody was ready to fight anyway. So the spark was when Samuel Parris's daughter and niece were discovered to be learning voodoo lore and exotic dances from Parris's West Indian slave, Tituba. Again, this is more detailed than than the notes give us, but I felt like I would mention it. One of the like voodoo lore things they were learning was essentially like fortune telling. I mean, these girls were kids. Like they were 11 and 12 maybe. You know, they were just at the age where they're exploring new things. In particular, what caused them to freak out was this type of fortune telling where you would crack an egg into like a crystal globe, I think, and the yolk would make a shape that would represent like your future husband or whatever. And again, these are young girls, and that's, you know, the thing. And also, you're in a Puritan town. There is nothing going on. So, you know, they're just trying to be entertained. However, because they grew up in a Puritan town, everything is a sign. And what they saw when the egg was cracked into the globe was a skull, as opposed to like the face of their future husband. So they freak out. And it wasn't long before people started noticing that these girls are like having panic attacks. And then everything goes from there. So of course they blamed Tituba for teaching them these things. Oh, she enchanted us and made us learn the voodoo, whatever. But they also started blaming other members of the community. First, an elderly female pauper, so again, someone who couldn't defend herself. A homeless widow, someone who couldn't defend herself. But then they began blaming or pointing out respectable church women, a minister, a wealthy merchant, and even a 4-year-old child, because you know the kids are always down with Satan. So by the end of this, about 100 people were accused, 80% of whom were, of course, women, but there were men who were accused of witchcraft as well. And I'll get into how this accusation how that worked in here in just a second. It got so bad that the governor of Massachusetts, William Phipps, set up a special court to handle this, brought in a bunch of Puritan leaders to preside over the court to make sure things go properly, which again, we're in Puritan New England, so that's kind of the norm, including Samuel Sewell, who we just saw a couple of slides ago, who was complaining about everything. Well, now he's here, so clearly he's going to be an unbiased and reliable source of information. Speaking of which, a lot of this evidence that came from them were dreams and visions that the girls had. Totally provable evidence in court. But again, this is Puritan New England, so it's like, oh, I dreamed that so-and-so was consorting with the devil. Well, clearly it's true. This resulted in 20 executions by the end of it, which, again, if you recall from the previous slide, over the course of like almost a century, we had 160 people accused, and 15 of them were executed. Well, over the course of less than a year, more than 100 people were accused, and 20 were executed. That's a much larger percentage, and especially all at once. However, the accusations continue because anyone who was accused of consorting with the devil could then say, well, I was given visions that so-and-so was involved. So like it just spread. They began accusing prominent Salem and Boston families. So the governor of Massachusetts stepped in and was like, all right, we need to put an end to this. So like it didn't end because they realized that maybe we're wrong. It ended because important people were being accused. And if important people started getting executed, then there would be a lot of trouble. Also, I should mention, and this is also something that's not in the book, but I remember reading about this in other sources. One of the theories as to what happened was actually proposed by I want to say it was a biology student about a decade ago. Basically, based on the records we have, the area had been very rainy during this period, so there was a lot more moisture. And they had been growing their rye nearish to a swamp. In other words, there's a really good chance that the rye, which they use to make bread, had been infected by ergot, which is a type of fungus. And ergot poisoning will mess with your literally will mess with your neurons. Like, it makes you twitch and see things and, like, go into convulsions, which were all signs of being possessed by the devil. So there was a really good chance that these people had accidentally poisoned themselves due to, the fungus in the rye, and due to the Puritan worldview, it led to this. So that's a thing. Also have some really interesting images here. Here's something happening. I do appreciate that this dude over here is ready to pull his sword on that lightning. This dude, he's called it quits. Yeah, there's a lot happening. Now, most of the witches the accused, I should say, were either hanged, drowned, or in the case of one, pressed to death with stones. Over in Europe, they had a different way of doing things, as I've alluded to. They strapped you to a log and made you a bonfire. And this was, once again, a public spectacle. Everybody would come out and watch the witches being tortured to death. Also, if any of the accused witches had a child, the child was probably also, influenced by Satan, so into the bonfire you go. The last witch trial, I got it in my other book, but it'd take me a minute to find it. The last execution of a witch, I should say, happened in Poland in like the 1770s. So they were a little bit late to not doing that anymore. Salem was not so much a symptom of the norm, but an extreme case that made it so that sort of thing didn't really happen in America anymore. Even though you do still have some weirdos today that are like, bad weather, it's the witches, we gotta burn them. It's like, why are you here? All right. So obviously, we're talking about Salem and witches. We need to discuss what exactly women had to deal with in the colonies at this period. Because things were changing. Things have been changing, since, the Europeans arrived. But the 17th century was a big time of change. So early on, most of these settlers who came to North America were men, because again, the idea was to come and make farms, and that was about it. They didn't really have too much of an idea of, as we saw with the Puritans, bringing entire families over and starting communities. So the women who did come over as indentured servants would be in short supply, let's say. So many of these women could marry older men of wealth, the men would die, and the women would get their stuff. That was pretty much the only way that women would be able to get property rights, was to marry some old codger and then have him die. However, as we start getting towards the end of the 1600s, the gender ratios are starting to equalize. We're getting a lot more families coming over, a lot more women coming over. So the women workers weren't in as high a demand. And then also, slavery and indentured servitude, meaning that labor wasn't as required of everybody. This also meant that women were typically pushed into domestic labor roles rather than helping out on the farm, although, we'll get to that. Excuse me. So there's this English common law term, and again, Old English was still very French. So femme covert, a couvert, I don't know, again, French. Basically, a wife's legal status was seen as being covered over, or to directly translate it, hidden behind her husband's, which meant that a wife had the same legal standing as a child. They were basically, I wouldn't use the word owned, but it's really close to that. Essentially owned by the husband. They had no real legal recourse. The husband made all the decisions. They were just there. But as things changed through the 17th century, the idea of a patriarchal family was seen as the bulwark against all this disorder. Because, again, we're getting more than just English here in the English colonies. And that's, scary for the people already here, so they need to tighten more control. This was especially true in wealthy families, where they would often use marriage between their sons and daughters as almost like a political alliance between, say, merchant families. So there was some escape from the strict fathers and husbands, but for the most part, women were trapped in the structure even after their husband died, because as we saw with Salem, or not necessarily Salem, but the witchcraft thing, even after their husband died, there would often be some sort of contention over who actually got the property rights. Again, usually a male member of the family would come in and try to take over, or like a male neighbor would claim that they had more rights over the property than the wife did. And when it comes to legal battles, it's going to be pretty one way. So I have this happy family here. I don't know, the dude already looks dead to me. They just propped him up. Also, I really like this long-ass pipe. Like, he's clearly using it. It's in his mouth, but it's also sitting on the table. Like, that feels like a lot of work. Again, the wife and daughter are just sewing because there was so much sewing to be done. The dog's taking a nap. The cats here are about to have a fight. Because if you know anything about cats, if they're looking at each other, they're about to tussle. It's just how cats work. Oh. So while the letter of the patriarchal order was that, men are doing one thing in particular and women are, essentially under their control, in most of the colonies, well, most of the people in the colonies, I should say, the farmers living outside the towns that are just trying to survive, there wasn't quite as much of this. For example, Benjamin Wadsworth wrote a book, The Well-Ordered Family, urged couples to delight in each other's company, be helpful to each other, and bear one another's burdens. Because a lot of these marriages had nothing to do with whether you wanted to be together or not. It was a marriage of convenience. In the case of some of the wealthier families, again, the family's convenience as opposed to you. So say with artisans, the wives would often learn the husband's crafts as well as helping with the apprentices, because as I mentioned, apprenticeship was almost like adoption, where the apprentice would come in and live with the family and learn the trade, and so they would be right there alongside the kids of the people running the shop. But also the women would usually learn how to run the shop if, say, the husband was out or sick or they just needed to. And as I mentioned with the farms, while men and women had distinctive roles, they both still did farm work. There wasn't, well, I'll just get there. So while most wives and daughters worked in the home, they still did work on the farm. Garden, milk house, chicken coop, dairy, the wash house. And let me tell you, washing clothes back then was a pain in the ass. The clothes were made out of linen, which today when we think of linen, we think of like, towels and washcloths. Linen is plant material. It's flax, I think. And when that stuff gets wet, it gets heavy. That's why back then, like, they'd wash clothes maybe once every couple of months, just knock the dirt off of them. Because when you bring them to wash them, you're just trying to beat the dirt off of them. Because, again, they're really heavy, they're really solid. Washing was a pain in the butt. Husbands and sons typically did the work out in the fields, livestock, orchards, that sort of thing. But everybody was still doing farm work. And while they did have their own distinctive roles, this wasn't like what we think of when it comes to the frontier, which again, at this point, the frontier is like the middle parts of the Atlantic states. They bring in servants, slaves, hired farm hands, people to help maintain the whole area, because the yield was so small that you needed to have at least 100 acres, if not more, just to make enough to survive the year and be able to grow next year. And that's a lot of land for a few people to run. And as I mentioned, especially with my American technology course, a lot of times, especially during the harvest season, they just bring people in. The husband, the wife, the kids, the grandparents, neighbors, random dudes off the street, come and help harvest. Because if it goes bad on the vine, that's it. And those that did make enough money to have surplus crops, they would trade with local communities. Here we go. So they would often work together, the various farmsteads, households, etc., where, say, one farm would focus on making, growing wheat, and another farm would usually have, say, a lot of chickens, so they would have a lot of eggs, and they would just trade for what, say, the other didn't have. And especially if a farm managed to have a grist mill, which is the big wheels with the big rock wheels that turn and grind the wheat into flour. Usually that's either a windmill, or here in North America, usually a water wheel. People would come and trade whatever they had to use the grist mill, because that stuff was expensive. And it was much better to just have somebody you knew and you could use theirs than try to build your own, or go into town, because that would be miles away. And again, the most we have at this time is maybe wagons. Here we have a not so good situation here. It looks like the father and perhaps older brother have died. So you've got the wife here with this horse that looks like it's about to kick the bucket, and they've even got a dog lashed to the plow. That's the word I'm looking for. With perhaps the younger child here trying to help out as well. They're going to have a hard time making it. Just the two of them and a couple of animals. Now, of course, if we're talking about women in, especially the 1700s, one of their main roles, I suppose I should say, is, making more little goblin childs. With farm work requiring men and women to work, marriage was seen as more an economic thing. as well as, the social and religious situation that it was. But again, most of the time you got married because you had to survive. You couldn't make it on your own. With mortality gradually declining, by 1700, if a woman lived to 45, she could have between 6 and 8 kids. And with, again, mortality declining, most of them lived to adulthood, as opposed to some of the worst regions where women would have like 12 kids and you'd maybe get 3 of them. And that was one of the reasons they had so many kids, is you just need the free farm labor. Up in New England, you had a better chance of surviving, while in the Chesapeake region, which again, Virginia and all the lovely mosquitoes, women tended to die in higher numbers. Obviously, among enslaved Africans and African Americans, fertility was much lower because they were mistreated. And I mean, it was hard enough to be healthy as an English colonist in North America at the time. So if you're enslaved, yeah, good luck. And it wasn't until the 1740s that the mortality rate had dropped enough that more slaves were actually being born into America than being imported from overseas. Which again, that's going to be important when Britain decides that they don't like the slave trade anymore. And since they control the ocean, that's everybody else's problem too. Of course, this depended on where they worked. Some, of course, working in the fields would be more poorly treated and would be working themselves to exhaustion daily. Whereas, doing domestic work, it was still tough because, like I said, clothes were extremely heavy, especially when you're trying to wash them. And trying to keep a household of 8 freaking kids in order, not easy work, but this tended to kill them less. Also, as we had immigrants coming from Europe, particularly the Irish and the Scots, and especially the Irish, because for one of the Catholic things is have a bunch of kids, and the Irish were very Catholic, so they tended to have a lot of kids. But regardless of where they were, mothers tended to have to not just deal with the kids, but also continue doing all that work I just mentioned. Because just because you spat a child out of your body doesn't mean you can't continue doing work, at least in the 1700s. Now, the richer families could afford nannies or wet nurses to take care of the kids, at least early on. But for the most part, you were on your own. You had to have the kids and take care of the kids and also continue doing the work. And of course, having the kid at all was dangerous. The mortality rate for mothers was about 1 in 30. 1 in 30 births resulted in the mother dying. In fact, I've got a quote here in the book. Let's see. Colonists feared the deaths of the mothers as well as of infants. In 1700, roughly 1 out of 30 births ended in the mother's death. Women who bore 6 to 8 children thus faced death on a regular basis. Many prayed intensely before and during labor, hoping to survive the ordeal. One minister urged pregnant women to prepare their souls, claiming, "For ought you to know, your death has entered into you." Yeah. Having kids sucks. So if the mother died, the father would often get remarried pretty immediately, because while he had legal authority over the kids, dealing with them was seen as women's work, and you can't have a single father out there dealing with kids. So here's a terrifying, soulless child family here. And here we have an actual photograph. This is probably more from the 1800s. But again, the slave families were dealing with kids as much as anybody else, in addition to everything else. All right, let's get a little further. So, all of this is, the patriarchal order on paper, but as we often see, how things went in theory didn't necessarily translate to how they went in practice. We have reports of domestic violence. As for runaway spouses, petitions for divorce, legal suits charging rape, seduction, or breach of contract, because again, a lot of the marriages were just contractual obligations as opposed to any kind of people getting along. Of course, women reporting mistreatment at the hands of their husbands were often disregarded, because it's the 1700s. And also, it's America. However, depending on the community they lived in, sometimes they could besmirch their husband's reputation so much that basically the town would turn on him, and the only thing he could really do was just, up and leave town. Because if, say you've got maybe 3 merchants in the town and all 3 of them believe that you're a wife-beating piece of shit, they're not going to trade with you. And if you can't trade with the only 3 merchants in town, you're not going to survive. So, while this was certainly not actual legal recourse, it was one of the few options that women had. Again, it was very depending on where they were. Like if you're in, say, Boston or Salem, where it's a big city, well, relatively big city, it's not going to work quite as well. Obviously, divorce was not an easy thing. Just about all the power went to the husband, because of course it did. But even then, and this is perfect case scenario where, let's say, the husband and wife don't get along. They both agree that they should get a divorce because it's not working out. They'll both be happy not under this contract anymore. You can't just go up to the county clerk and sign a piece of paper and be done. They had to get the permission of the city council, which in Puritan New England was run by church leaders. So oftentimes they wouldn't let you get a divorce. And that's if both sides are agreeing to it. Obviously, if the wife wants a divorce, nobody's going to listen to that. But even in the case of everybody agrees, the city council can still tell them no. So women who had access to money and land had some amount of legal power, whereas poor and enslaved women had, well, none, needless to say. So the only real recourse was to run away, was to just up and leave, which, again, wasn't always easy because, well, especially in the case of enslavement, there's the whole system keeping you where you are. But even for colonial women, if they were to run away and try to start a life in another town, if word got to that other town that they had run from their husband, they could just be carted back. And also, starting over in a new town as a woman in colonial America wasn't exactly the easiest thing to do. Because again, you had no real legal rights for yourself. So a lot of women began turning to their sisters and friends to help them out, as opposed to the normal authority figures, which is to say fathers and ministers, because the fathers and ministers were more interested in maintaining the status quo than actually helping victims. Because the fathers and ministers were benefiting from the system, and they wanted to keep it where it was. Because, of course. Now, this next image, well, I'll just go ahead and pull it up. So, before we really even talk about what's going on in the image, the actual style of it, this was a format that was used a lot in this time period. We're going to see it again at least once more. But, today with the internet, you've got, meme formats where you just take the words and pictures out and put something new in, but it's the same format. This was used a lot in this time period. This idea of this is where you start, and then you make your way up, and this is like, the apex of your life, and then you eventually go to your end. This was originally was like the Pilgrim's Progress, where it's like someone coming to religion and becoming part of the community, and then eventually dying in God's glory or whatever. So this is actually an adaptation of that, of like the little girl being born. You've got like a young deer here. No, wait, where's the... Down here, a rabbit. Then as she gets older, you've got like a deer where she's still young, but she's got energy, she's graceful. As she gets older, you've got like the maternal age, which is seen as like the apex of a woman's life. And then on your way down to this old decrepit cat ready to go to death at the ripe old age of like 45. And then again, here you have in the middle the mother teaching her daughter, which is just continuing the cycle. And there's a lot of stuff down here, but I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, we'll see this again in different formats, which I just find interesting that like that's been a thing forever. Okay, let's see. It is 9:40. The next thing is the economy. I think this is a good spot to end. So, drop your tests off here on the way out, and I'll see you guys next week.